Shalom, everybody, and welcome to Youth for Torah, where we dig deep to learn more about Elohim. We're going to talk about Parasha 8, that was for Shabbat, December 6, that is called Yishlach. We can find this in Genesis 32, verse 4, till Genesis 36, verse 43. Verse 4, we see that Yaakov reaches Esav's country and sends out messengers as if to test the waters. We see later on that the messengers return to Yaakov and they inform him that Esav is coming out to meet him with 400 men. Now, in biblical times, when a man would go out with a certain group of men to meet another man, it wasn't in a friendly manner. It was more of a bellical manner, seeking to wage war, seeking to fight. So it's understandable that Yaakov felt fear at seeing that number of men coming towards his way, taking into consideration that probably he didn't have that number of men to help defend himself and that he was traveling with his family. Why do we say this, that when a man goes with a certain group of men, it's in a bellical manner? We can see that in Genesis 14:14. As an example, we have Abraham. Abraham, in order to save his nephew Lot, he took 318 skilled men with him, and together with those 318 men, they defeated those 5 kings from the plains of Sodom, if we remember from a previous parasha. But still, in the midst of this distress, in the midst of all of this chaos, even though he was afraid, Yaakov asks God for help, reminding Elohim of the ancestral promise and holding on to that promise. It's like as if he would have heard or read Psalm 18. Of course, it wasn't until later on that David wrote this psalm, but this is to remind us as well. Psalm 18:6 says, "In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even into his ears." So as humans, it's natural for us to feel fear, to be afraid. Yet in our distress, our first response must be to call upon our God, for God will show us the way and deliver us from that chaotic moment. Then, continuing on from verses 14 through 16, we see that Yaakov prepares a gift for Esav from his possessions. His gift totaled 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 female sheep, 20 male sheep, 30 milk camels and their coats, 40 cows, 10 bulls, and 20 male donkeys with 10 colts. This was quite a wise strategy because, in a way, it was as if trying to appease or trying to calm Esav. This strategy is also mentioned in the Bible later on by King Shlomo in Proverbs. Proverbs 21:14 says, "A gift in secret averts anger, and a concealed bribe strong wrath." So it was a wise strategy from Yaakov in order to see if with this he could make Esav more favorable towards him and free himself from sudden disaster. We see in verses 17 through 22 that Yaakov divided the present in droves so that Esav will receive multiple gifts instead of one single gift. And this would also give him time in order to plan what was he going to do to protect his family. Verses 23 to 24, we see that Yaakov sends his family and possessions across the Yabok River, and he remained alone. This word alone in Hebrew is bad, meaning alone or apart. That means secluded or excluded from a group of people. But if we analyze it in the Paleo Hebrew, we have here the chart, we have the bet and we have the dalet. And if we put those two together, we get a pathway into. In other words, a pathway into oneself. When going through different problems, sometimes it's good to have an alone time. It allows you to think clearly and you are more open to hearing God's words, God's message for you. It's a pathway for God to speak with you. There are many examples in the Bible where a person had to be alone in order to experience God fully. We have, for example, Moshe when he went up to Sinai. Shmuel, when God told him what was going to happen to Eli's sons. Manoah's wife, Samson's mother, when she was receiving the news that she would give birth to Samson. Daniel in the lion's den. Elijah in the cave when he heard God's voice. When he heard God's voice. And even Yeshua himself would go apart alone in order to pray to God, aside and apart from his disciples. So it's important to have an alone time with God, especially when we're going through hard times, difficult times, when we have a lot of thoughts invading our mind and we have a lot of people talking to us. Sometimes it's good to set ourselves apart and have that alone time with God in order to hear God's voice more clearly. In verse 25, we see that while he was alone, a man comes and starts to wrestle with him until daybreak. Now, this word wrestle is avak, that means to cause dust. So in reality, this was a physical battle, because in order for you to lift up dust, you have to be engaged in a strong physical encounter. So he was waging a physical battle. Yaakov had two battles going on, mentally with how to deal with Esav, and the mental battle was now being expressed through a physical battle with this man that came to wrestle with Yaakov. In verse 26, we see that the man could not prevail against Yaakov, so he dislocates Yaakov's hip from the socket. This is quite an interesting event. Why this happened is not explicitly explained, but one way to see it is through the words playing out here. We have three important words. We have akav, that is supplant, that is what forms Yaakov's name. We have yaka, that means to dislocate, and we have avak, that is wrestle. Now, if we look at it in detail, looking at it in the Paleo Hebrew, we see here that there are some Hebrew letters that repeat between these three words, and there are some that don't. The letters that repeat, we have the kuf, that seems like a line in a little circle. This line in a little circle represents the sun on the horizon. In other words, it is kind of like giving us the hint at the time that this thing occurred. In other words, at sunrise, at dawn. Another letter that repeats itself but twice, not three times, we have the ayin and we have the bet. Ayin means to see or to experience, and bet could mean house or place or inn. So a place of experience. It was Yaakov being in that particular moment, having this wrestling with this man, but at the same time, it's the fact that Yaakov was in a place by himself. And the only two letters that don't repeat themselves is the Yud and the Aleph. Yud meaning work and Aleph meaning leader. So this is the leader's work. In other words, at this particular time, in other words, dawn, at this particular place, and because of the state that Yaakov was in, being alone, the leader's work was going to be revealed. And this happens in the following verse. This is how the words play out. In verse 27, in the complete Jewish Bible version, other Bible versions have it as verse 26. It says, the man said, let me go. In other words, dislocate from me, yaka, because it's daybreak. Here we have the kuf. But Yaakov, the word akav, replied, I won't let you go. In other words, I'm wrestling with you, abak, unless you bless me, an action that can only be done by God, a blessing. Here we see how those words play out. So at daybreak, Yaakov would experience at that place God's work that is a particular and special blessing. We see in verse 29, that is in the complete Jewish version, in other versions it's verse 28, that God's work, special work, is revealed. Yaakov's name is changed to Israel. It says because he showed both his strength to God and to man and prevailed. Now, Israel is quite an interesting name. Most of the time it's translated, or it's given the definition of he who contends with God, or he who wrestles or fights with God. But in reality, that is not the meaning of Israel. Israel is composed of two words. We have Yasar and El. Yasar comes from Sarah, that means prince. In other words, as a prince. And El means God. So here it's actually saying that Yaakov would stand as a prince before God. That is the real meaning. Yaakov, the name Yaakov, Yaakov had already fulfilled the essence of that particular name when he had taken the place of his brother in order to bring about God's prophecy spoken to Rivka, his mother. These past 20 years, or perhaps more, we don't know how long he traveled, Yaakov had shown God his strength as he prevailed against human forces like Lavan, and now we're going to see Esav as well, Lavan's household, and he continued to show God his strength through this last spiritual and physical test, having to face Esav and wrestling with the man that God had sent. Yaakov showed the true strength of a prince. So this was the time to anoint Yaakov with a new name because he had already fulfilled the name Yaakov. This name is even more special because in this name God is present, as if God's saying, from now on, you will never be alone. Not you, not your descendants, not all of the nation that's going to come forth from you. Israel was to become a nation. And as you can see, God is present in the name. God is present in Israel. Therefore, as children of Israel, we all must be like Yaakov. We have to be princes and princesses before Elohim, living like a prince of God. Living like a prince of God, how? Obeying his commandments. We see in verse 30 that Yaakov asks the man for his name. So it's like, okay, you just gave me a new name, so can you please tell me your name? While Yaakov had received this divine name, it wasn't yet time for God to reveal his name. We're going to see in a future parasha when God decides to reveal his real name to Israel as a whole. But in that particular time, it was not yet the moment for God to reveal his name. Now, concerning this new name of Yaakov, we're going to see that it's not yet going to be put into use. There's a particular moment later on in this parasha where this name is put to use, and we're going to see that later on. Moving on to chapter 33 comes the encounter with Esav. We see that Yaakov divides his family in groups. He puts the sons of his concubines along with the concubines first, then Leah and her sons, and then Rachel and her sons. And he himself goes first. And we see that as he approaches Esav, he prostrates himself 7 times. Remember, 7 is the number of covenant or a pact. Yaakov was demonstrating to Esav that his gift was sincere and that he intended no harm to Esav, as if saying, I'm making a covenant with you, that I intend no harm for you. In verse 4, we see that Esav runs to meet him and hugs him and kisses him. Now, this is something that is not seen in any other translation of the Bible. It is only seen in the Hebrew. The word, and he kissed Yaakov, that word kiss, it's written with 6 dots on top of the word, as if to single this word out. Now, why 6 dots? We see that Yaakov approaches and prostrates himself 7 times. In other words, the number linked to covenant. Yet, 6 is the number of man. In other words, it represents insincerity. Why? Because a man or the human being is not a person it's not somebody you can rely on. We can only rely on God because man is completely volatile, it's vulnerable. Man can fail many times. In other words, it was as if to single out that this kiss was not a sincere kiss. It could be possible that Esav could have been moved with the gift and could have felt some sort of sorrow or pity toward Jacob or some sort of positive emotion. But behind all of the act, his motives weren't sincere and he did not have good intentions. So Esav meets Yaakov's family and is persuaded to accept the gift. We see that in verses 5 through 11. Verses 12 to 16, we see that Yaakov apparently perceives Esav's disingenuous manner, for he decides not to follow Esav to Seir, but to go in another direction when Esav suggests that he follows him and goes back to his country. In verse 17, Yaakov arrives to a place where he pitches his tent, calling it the place of tents. In other words, Sukkot. Now, verses 18 through 20, we see that it says the following thing. Having traveled from Padan Aram, Yaakov arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and set up camp near the city. From the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of silver a parcel of land where he pitched his tent. There he put up an altar which he called El Elohei Yisrael, God, the God of Israel. Yaakov was acknowledging God as the one true God of Israel, accepting and believing in the promise that God would bring forth a nation from him. This place would have an even greater importance later on in history. To show you that great importance, let's jump to John 4, verses 5 through 42. In the New Testament, we see that Yeshua arrives at this same place. And we see that Yaakov had built a well, and it's understandable because everywhere they would pitch a tent, we saw that with Abraham, we saw that with Yitzhak, they would always dig a well. We see that Yeshua arrives at the field that Yaakov had bought, and he arrives at the well that Yaakov built. And a certain woman, a Samaritan woman, or the correct word would be from Shomron, arrives to draw for water. And Yeshua asks this woman for water. In verse 9, she says, "How is it that you, a Jew, asks for water from me, a woman of Shomron?" So we can see that there is an antagonism between the Jewish people in that day and the people of Shomron. And the question is, why? Why was it that these two groups of people did not get along? The answer is quite simple, and it's located in 2 Kings 17:24 through verses 40. If we remember, when the kingdoms had been divided, when Israel had been divided, we had the kingdom of the north, that was the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of the south, that was the kingdom of Judah. And the kingdom of Israel had the capital, Samaria or Shomron. Now, Israel was taken captive first, and when Israel was taken captive, the king of Ashur brought people from Bavel, Kuta, Ava, Hamat, and Sepharvaim, and settled them there in Shomron. Since they had pagan practices and had idols and certain bad traditions, Bible mentions that God sent lions to kill them little by little, so people started dying little by little. Seeing this, Ashur sent an Israelite Kohen to teach them about God, because they related the fact that the death of these people was occurring due to the lack of knowledge of Elohim. So they sent an Israelite Kohen to teach them about God. They learned to fear God, but they still held on to their pagan practices. So they had fear of God, they had knowledge of God, but they still did not eradicate completely their pagan origin. So they were kind of like an odd mix of God-fearing, Torah-fearing people, and at the same time they were pagan-fearing, pagan-keeping people. So it could have been that the Jews that returned after exile resented this, that they, being foreign people, having lived in the land, were not kicked out despite having this mixed way of living, this mixed Torah paganism. And because at that time they also followed Adonai. And it is also obvious that the people of Shomron had knowledge of Adonai due to what the woman speaks in verse 20 and 25. She says, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you people say that the place where one has to worship is in Yerushalayim, as we know, because there was the temple." And in verse 25, the woman says, "I know that Mashiach is coming, that is the one who has been anointed. When he comes, he will tell us everything." That is also present in the prophets, because it is said that Mashiach will teach Torah to the people. So that's why this woman was surprised when Yeshua, being a male Jew, was talking to a woman from Shomron. But when you come and think about it for a moment, that behavior that the people of Shomron had is quite a lot like how many Christians behave nowadays. Many times Christians have a sincere love for God and worship God and follow God, yet they hold on to pagan practices. Pagan practices such as what? Such as Halloween, such as Christmas. None of these have biblical origin. All of them have pagan origins. If you want, you can go and check it for yourself. But the thing is that many times, as followers of God, we make the mistake of mixing tradition or what is trendy or what is innovative made by human beings instead of just sticking to what God has said in His Word. Anyway, continuing with the story of this interaction between Yeshua and the woman of Shomron, here we see that Yeshua talks about a certain water. In verse 13 till 14, it says, Yeshua answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will get thirsty again," referring to the physical water drawn out of the well. Verse 14 says, "But whoever drinks the water I will give him will never be thirsty again. On the contrary, the water I give him will become a spring of water inside him, welling up into eternal life." What is this water? What was Yeshua referring to? If we go to Proverbs 18:4, it says, "The words of a man's mouth are as deep waters, and the wellspring of wisdom as a flowing brook." In other words, water is compared to words, something that flows from the spring of the heart. And as we know, mentioned in John 1 through 4, Yeshua is the Word of God. In other words, Torah made man. But what is the difference between Yeshua, that was the spiritual or expression of Torah, and the Torah given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai? We'll see that in Romans 3, verses 20 through 22, that says, "For in his sight no one alive will be considered righteous on the ground of legalistic observance of Torah commands, because what Torah really does is to show people how sinful they are. But now, quite apart from Torah, God's way of making people righteous in his sight has been made clear, although the Torah and the prophets give their witness to it as well, and it is a righteousness that comes from God through the faithfulness of Yeshua the Messiah to all who continue trusting. For it makes no difference whether one is a Jew or a Gentile." The Torah given to us on Sinai, as it says here, only shows us our sin. It is important. Yes, we must keep it because Yeshua said, "Your sins are forgiven, go and sin no more." But this Torah only shows us the sin, but it cannot make us righteous. In other words, it does not atone for our sin. So if we think about water, Torah is the sensation of thirst telling us we are dehydrated, but it does not hydrate us. It gives us the warning sign like, hey, you are dehydrated, you are sinning, you are doing what is wrong, but it doesn't clean you, it doesn't quench your thirst. The only way to become atoned for righteous is through Yeshua. This applies to both the Jew and the non-Jew. Yeshua gives us salvation, which is the water that quenches the thirst. And we can see that in Isaiah 12:3. Isaiah 12:3 says, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." So yes, Torah helps us single out our sin, and Yeshua saves us from that sin. Continuing on with the conversation that he had with the woman from Shomron, we see John 4:21 through 24, it says, Yeshua said, "Lady, believe me, the time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Yerushalayim. You people don't know what you are worshiping. We worship what we do know because salvation comes from the Jews." I want to make a quick pause right here. When he said, "You people don't know what you are worshiping," it's fact. Why? Because if we remember what is mentioned in Kings, they had a mix of belief. So they worshiped God, but at the same time they had pagan gods and had pagan practices, and keeping certain pagan traditions and practices is idolatry and is pagan worship. So that's why he says you don't know what you're worshiping because you have not known God completely. We worship what we do know. They do know what they worship because God was manifested to the Jews, and salvation comes from the Jews. Why? Because Yeshua is Jewish. He goes on to say in verse 23, "But the time is coming indeed, it's here now, when the true worshippers will worship the Father spiritually and truly. For these are the kind of people the Father wants worshiping him. God is spirit, and worshippers must worship him spiritually and truly." Yeshua talks about true worship, the expression of the living water in us granted by Yeshua, that we return to God. That sincere expression of love and reverence for God is within us, and it can be manifested through our worship that can be anywhere in reality. Why? Because, as we see in 1 Corinthians 6:19, it says, Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price, the blood of Yeshua. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. We don't have a physical temple as the Israelites had in those times, but we have our bodies. So there isn't an excuse for us not to worship God. That time, Yeshua said, it's now, and the time will come. In other words, from that moment forward up to now, we must continue the worshiping in sincerity and in true spirit, because that is the expression of our love, of that overflowing water that we have for our God. Why? Because we are the temples of the Ruach HaKodesh. In verse 26, we see that Yeshua reveals that he is the Mashiach to the woman of Shomron. The woman goes to the town and testifies of Yeshua, and they come and see him and talk with him themselves. In verse 42, they believe that he is the Savior of the world. So at the place where Yaakov affirmed that Elohim is the God of Israel, believing in the promise God had made to his fathers, at that same place Yeshua was affirmed as Mashiach, Savior of the world, both to the non-Jew and to the Jew, for his disciples were present. So now we head on to the next chapter, that's chapter 34, verses 1 through 4. It says that Dinah goes to visit the local girls, and during her visit, she is captured by Shechem, the son of Hamor, and is raped and humiliated, a horrible act. Verse 5 says that Yaakov hears the news and waits for his sons to return. His sons were in the age where biblically they were considered men. As men, brothers also had a say in the course of action to take. A similar example was seen in a previous parasha when Lavan had to give his input on the decision of Rivka going as a bride for Yitzhak. They come in verse 7 and they're saddened and very angry. Of course, how are they not going to be for what happened to their sister? And in verses 8 through 10, Hamor comes and presents himself before Yaakov and proposes the idea of intermarrying. In other words, giving their sons for their daughters and their daughters for their sons. Now, this proposal given by Hamor the Hivite was extremely dangerous. We see later on in Deuteronomy 7 verses 2 through 4, it says, "And when the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor shew mercy unto them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly." In other words, this act of intermarrying with a pagan nation was a direct ticket to destroying all that God had built up. So this was something that simply could not happen. We see later on that the sons of Yaakov come up with a deceitful plan. In verses 13 through 17, they tell Hamor and Shechem that all the men had to be circumcised in order for they to accept the deal, and only if they got circumcised would they let Shechem marry Dinah. But they weren't the only ones who had a deceitful intention. Hamor himself also had a deceitful intention. In verses 20 through 23, the proposal for intermarrying had another end. It wasn't for Shechem to have Dinah, but it was in order to absorb the children of Israel completely. For he says, their flocks and their belongings is now going to become ours. So we see from verses 25 to 29 that Shimon and Levi take advantage of the third day post-circumcision, that's considered the most painful day, and destroyed every single man of the city and took the children and women captive and looted all the houses. It's possible that from these women, the sons of Yaakov chose wives. We do not know if all of them did or if some of them did, but it is possible because there wasn't any other women available and they had taken these women captive. This impulsive and chaotic behavior displayed by these two brothers is perhaps the result of their age. We don't know exactly how old they were, but it is possible that they were in their teenager years, in their teens. Why? Because if we remember, Yaakov started having his children post 7 years of service, in other words, for 14 years, plus the 6 years that he served Laban. The 7 years plus 6 years is 13, plus the traveling, so we have about 14, 15, could be a little bit more of years that he had his sons in that period of time. So we don't know how much he took from Padan Aram all the way to the place where he is now. It could add more years to it, but they were very young. This could be the reason why they had this impulsive and chaotic behavior. Now, Torah doesn't mention if this was good or bad. God did not intervene in this particular act that these brothers brought about on the Hivites. But one thing is for sure is that thanks to this act is that proposal of intermarrying or the proposal of being absorbed completely, that danger was averted immediately. Heading on to chapter 35, verse 1, we see that God tells Yaakov to go to Beit El and build an altar. It says, God said to Yaakov, get up, go to Beit El and live there, and make there an altar to God, who appeared to you when you fled Esav your brother. This is a beautiful demonstration of God's love and how he keeps his promises, because by telling Yaakov to do this, it's his response to what Yaakov asked Elohim to make as a vow for him, as we see in Genesis 28, 20 through 22, that was from the previous Parasha. Yaakov took this vow. If God will be with me and will guard me on this road that I am traveling, giving me bread to eat and clothes to wear so that I return to my father's house in peace, then Adonai will be my God, and this stone which I have set up as a standing stone will be God's house, and everything you give me, I will faithfully return 1/10 to you. So here we see how God is saying, I protected you, I was with you all these years, and I have brought you back just as you had requested. We see in verses 2 through 4 that Yaakov asks his household, in other words, his wives and his sons, to rid themselves of the foreign gods and pagantries that they had acquired, and to purify themselves. He takes all of these and buries them under a strong tree near Shechem. Now the question is, where did these idols come from? Well, the answer is a little bit previous to what happened with the sons of Yaakov, Shimon and Levi. It came from the looting that Shimon and Levi did on the Hivites. They had taken everything that was in the houses. So it's highly probable that they took with them as well the idols that could have been of gold, silver, valuable, precious stones, who knows? But these things were forsaken objects, so they had to disappear. Now, they left the idols behind buried. This comes to make us think, why didn't they destroy the idols? We won't know until we ask God ourselves, but it's quite interesting to see that instead of destroying it, like what Moshe did to Aaron's calf of gold, they decided to bury it there in Shechem. But there was a huge importance in purifying themselves and removing these foreign gods, because by moving these foreign gods, by removing all of these forsaken objects, this allowed God's presence to be with them. And what was the result? Verse 5. While they were traveling, a terror from God fell upon the cities around them, so that none of them pursued the sons of Yaakov. In other words, they traveled peacefully. We see in verses 6 to 7, Yaakov arrives at Beit El just as Adonai had instructed him, and builds the altar El Beit El, God of Beit El. Then we see in verse 8 something quite interesting. It says that Deborah, Rivka's nurse, dies and is buried under an oak that is later called the oak of sorrow, the oak of weeping. Now, this verse is quite odd and may seem that it doesn't belong to the story, because not once has this certain woman been mentioned in all of Jacob's story. We do hear of her in Genesis 24:59, because it is mentioned not by name, but it is mentioned that Rivka came to the land of Canaan with her nurse. But what do we know about this woman, and why was she so important to mention? According to Rashi, Deborah was sent by Rivka to bring Yaakov back in response to what she had said in Genesis 27:45. Rivka had said that she would send for Yaakov and bring him back once Esav's anger had subsided. Now, this could be why this certain woman, Deborah, was with Yaakov. It could be that Rivka felt that Esav had subsided his anger, so she decided to send Deborah to bring Yaakov back. We don't know how long Deborah had been with Yaakov, how long, if she went to Padan Aram, or if she met them on the way. The Bible does not mention, but this could be a possibility of why she was with them. Now, what purpose had Deborah served? Nachmanides offers the idea that she helped raising the children. Similar to this, Targum Jonathan said that Deborah was a teacher, behaving as a spiritual guide for Yaakov's sons. So she was a key, according to what biblical scholars say, she was a key element into raising Yaakov's children into be God-fearing men, so that they wouldn't be influenced by the pagan customs and the idolatries that existed both in Padan Aram and in Canaan. So if she indeed completed that role faithfully, it's understandable that Yaakov came to be fond of her and respected her and was thankful to her, to the point of giving her a respectful burial and weeping for her when she died. We see in verses 9 through 15 that Adonai renews his promise to Yaakov and confirms the new name Israel. It says, after Yaakov arrived from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. Just what Yaakov had requested. Please don't go, bless me. So he blessed him. God said to him, your name is Yaakov, but you will be called Yaakov no longer. Your name will be Israel. Thus he named him Yisrael. God further said to him, I am El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed, a group of nations will come from you. Kings will be descended from you. Moreover, the land which I gave to Abraham and Yishlach, I will give to you, and I will give you the land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him there where he had spoken with him. Yaakov set up a standing stone in the place where he had spoken with him, a stone pillar. Then he poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. Yaakov called the place where God spoke with him Beit El. Then we come to an important part of the story. From verses 16 through 19, we see the last tribe, the 12th tribe of Israel, be born. The birth of Yaakov's 12th son was quite tragic, for it involved the death of his beloved Rachel. Now, what's interesting to see of this story is that Yaakov decides to change the name of his son, and it was something that he didn't do with his other sons. As we remember from the previous Parasha, each mother gave the name to their sons. Leah named her sons, and Rachel named her sons as well. But in this particular case, Yaakov decides to change his son's name. We see that as Rachel dies, she names her son Ben-Oni, that most of the time is translated as son of my affliction or son of my sorrow. In reality, this Oni comes from the word Aven. Aven means iniquity or idol. So, in other words, Rachel gave him the name Ben-Oni because she thought that this suffering that she had during birth, what had been brought upon her by the iniquity that she had done for carrying her father's idols. So it was like she thought that this was the consequences of carrying pagan foreign idols and for not getting rid of them as Yaakov had requested. So she went to name him Ben-Oni, son of my iniquity. Yaakov changes his name to Binyamin, that means son of my right hand, symbolizing in reality dexterity and strength. We must remember that names have power. So Yaakov was giving his son a different future. Instead of being a son prone to commit iniquity, he was going to be a son prone to show strength and a righteous pathway. Verse 21 is a very important verse because we see here Israel again set out and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder or Migdal Eder. This is the first time Yaakov is called as Israel in the narrative. First of all, like Yaakov went out, Yaakov spoke, Yaakov did this, Yaakov, and here's the first part where it's mentioned as Israel again set out and pitched his tent. Why? Because the 12 tribes were complete. Benjamin had to be born in order for his father to become a nation, the nation of Israel. Then we see that immediately after this important moment of becoming Israel, something happens in verse 22. We see that while they were at Migdal Eder, Reuben, the oldest son, slept with Bilhah. If we remember from the previous parasha, Bilhah was Rachel's handmaid, one of the concubines of Yaakov. Why did he do this? It is possible, and it's a possible explanation. It's not necessarily that that's the reason, but it is possible that he did this so that Bilhah would not displace his mother Leah, because as we remember, Leah was the unloved wife, and since Bilhah was Rachel's maidservant, it is possible that Reuben feared that now that Rachel was dead, that her maidservant would displace the mother's right to be the main wife. It could be the possibility. In verses 27 through 29, Yaakov comes home to his father. This completes the promise that Adonai had made to Yaakov, that he would make it safely back to his father's house. And we see that Yishlach was able to meet his grandchildren. Now the parasha ends in an interesting way. It ends with the genealogy of Esau, who were his sons' sons, and how his nation came about, who were the chieftains of his people. Now there are two important details that I want to show you here in chapter 36. In verses 11 and verses 15, we see that one of the descendants of Esau was Amalek. Now, Amalek had become, well, better said, Amalek will become a burden for Israel, and that's why I mentioned this. In Exodus 17, 8 to 13, it says that the Amalekites, in other words, the descendants of Amalek, attacked the Israelites on their journey toward the promised land. So while they were traveling, he came and attacked from the rear end, attacking all of the vulnerable, tired, and small children, elderly, all of the people that were weak. He attacked them and started exterminating them. And here we see that there was a huge battle that waged between the people of Israel we see that there was a huge battle between Israel and the Amalekites, and we remember from the story that every time that Moshe lifted up his staff, the people of Israel would prevail, and when his staff would come down, the Amalekites would prevail. So we see here that he needed help in order to keep his staff up, and they managed to destroy the Amalekites. Now, why is this also important? Because if we remember in the story of Esther, Haman, the Agagite, if you remember, Agag was a king from the Amalekite people. And thanks to this particular person, that is Haman, the Jewish people were almost exterminated. In other words, we were almost wiped out from the face of the earth if it had not been for God's intervention. So Amalek was going to be a real big headache for the people of Israel. And who did he come from? From Esav. So we can see that the promise, or the prophecy better said, given through Rivka, that there was going to be this enmity between the brothers, between Yaakov and Esav, was going to portray throughout all the generations, even up to now. Another important detail of Esav's descendants is that when they decided to appoint kings for themselves, they did not appoint people from their own kinsmen. They decided to appoint people from other nations. In other words, foreigners as kings. This also led them to have a chaotic and odd way of living based in pagan living and idolatry. And that concludes our parasha. I ask that God may bless you and keep you, and hopefully, God willing, we will see each other for the next parasha. May you have an awesome week, and may God bless you continuously. Bye-bye now.